glad that Ray went first. But listening to him talking about how, wondering had Filipinos ever done anything in this country made me feel very fortunate, because this generation here is my father's generation. And these are men that I grew up knowing when they would come through on their way to and from Alaska. And I grew up hearing stories about organizing in the asparagus fields, organizing in the cantaloupes, organizing in the canneries. And so my childhood stories that he would tell me, he told me stories about Jose Rizal, and he would tell me little stories, like he collected all kinds of interesting little jokes that he had. But a lot of the stuff he talked about was the things that they learned when they were organizing in the fields and in the canneries and in the lumber mills. And so I grew up knowing that we had this tremendous history of militancy. And as I've grown older, one of the things I kind of want to talk about maybe in the second round is the question of, they talked about how tough they were. And I think about that, and I know that that's one of the characteristics I was passed on to me. But I've always, you think about it. I mean, the Filipinos are somewhat unique among immigrants here, especially immigrants from Asia, because when they came here, they didn't come from a working class background. The Philippines was a completely agrarian country. And they came from a rural setting. My dad had to leave his hometown to go to high school because they didn't have secondary school where he came from. And that wasn't even that remote. That was just in Pangasinan. So you look at some of the really far-flung places where people came from, it was pretty remote and not too much going on there. And yet they came here, and what did they choose as the vehicle that they were going to fight against the oppression they found here? They joined the unions. They organized. They became part of the labor movement here, and a very, very well-respected part of it. And that's unusual. Immigrants do not necessarily come here and decide that what they're going to do is become trade unionists. Okay? And the second question, so what is it about the background that led them to that decision? Secondly, when they made that decision, why did they so good at it? Because everybody talks about their ability to organize. So think about that when you're thinking about the film and how you relate to it. What I did want to talk a little bit about, though, is what Eileen mentioned in the introduction, and that is my father's deportation case in the 1950s. Because it has a really direct connection to the story and the things that are depicted in the film. In the late 1940s, early 1950s, there was really a concerted effort by the growers, the cannery owners, the contractors to try and bust the unions. And basically the government stepped in on behalf of the employers and found ways in which they could enact laws and then use them, particularly against foreign-born workers. And so one of the things they did was the enactment of the Walter McCarran Act. And it was targeted against foreign-born workers, especially those activists. And so, for instance, in the early 1950s, there was a midnight raid where over 300 foreign-born workers around the United States were arrested under the Walter McCarran Act and held for deportation. And among them were 8 members of the Cannery Workers Union here in Seattle, including 6 members of the executive board. And what was the response going to be to this arrest? Because if it had stood, it would have decimated the union, because it would have wiped out the leadership of the union. And so a decision was made that my father would be the one to challenge the deportations because he was the business agent of the union. In fact, he was arrested when he was getting ready to get on a plane to go to Alaska to negotiate the contract for the season. He got out, he came back, they arrested him again when he was getting ready to get on the plane to go to negotiate the contracts in Alaska. Okay, such a coincidence. But they chose him And so he sued the government for wrongful imprisonment. And the case of Ernesto Manongs versus John P. Boyd, Director of Immigration, went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. But it was decided in the Ninth Circuit. And that decision was that Filipinos who came to the United States as U.S. nationals, so once the U.S. took possession of the Philippines and took over the government, between then and the enactment of the Philippine Independence Act of 1934, the 46,000 Filipinos who came here during that period were not deportable because they didn't come to the U.S. as aliens. They came as U.S. nationals. And what that means is that because of that decision, the men that we saw in this film were here. Because if that fight had not been won, the government and the growers and the cannery owners would have had a really potent weapon to use against anyone who spoke up. So if they had not been gone before, when they went on strike in '65, they would have been gone. But the fact is, because of that victory, they could not be deported. And I think the lesson, to me, one of the lessons is they didn't know in 1950, when they started fighting the deportations, that it was going to have an impact on the Great Strike in 1965. But what it says is, when you see an injustice, you see something that you have to fight against, you may not know what impact it's going to have, but you still have to fight it because you don't know. Because you don't know. And it might change the lives of people 20 or 30 years from now. But the fight is today. So think about it that way, that you're not just doing something for yourself or someone that you see around you for the immediate community, but it may have a far-reaching consequences.